most of you do not recognize me, but among many of you, I should be a familiar face. I'm just a student as you are. The topic pertaining to today's talk is something many of us are familiar with. In fact, many of our fates are intertwined with this topic. It should be apparent that you should probably listen to this, and very carefully too, as it concerns the past and future generations' education. I should ask any of you, do any of you among the crowd recognize who Henry Ford is? It's not an unfamiliar name. Most of you know him from the Industrial Revolution, or, the cars that he produced. But he is, for the past few generations, the father of the 5-day work week, or the $5 work week, the 8-hour one. The one that revolutionized the world and brought about 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of playtime, or work, as he called it. Why does this pertain to the topic in any particular way? Because education used to be so different from what it is now in the past. We should cover its history, because anyone who does not know anything about something's history is doomed to repeat it. It's a vicious cycle, I know, but that's why I'm here to educate you today. Education is closely related to the ancient Greeks, the cradle of civilization perhaps. The word for school, and scholarship, as scholars in general, is closely related to the ancient Greek word for leisure. That's how they viewed it. The Greeks saw education as something like leisure, and it was a lofty quality to possess. It was for anyone to think about. It was for anyone to receive. Though, most of the time, only the wealthy could allow their children to receive an education. Most philosophers decided that people who were not educated or did not decide to be educated were to be the blue-collar workers of the society that they lived in. This was a different case in ancient Egypt, where this wealthy separation was even further bridged by a gap between those who did not receive education and instead worshipped the pharaoh by building the great pyramids, and those who did philosophy and mathematics and geometry and other sciences of the time. Though they were rudimentary and fundamental, most of the education that they receive today still holds, most of the education that they received then still holds up today. In fact, we shouldn't be confused about this, as education is something that accumulates, instead of a rhetoric to be processed or something to break down and build up on again and again. It's something that should be covered in history classes, perhaps thoughts. Perhaps it should be a meta-arguments that should be apparent to any student. It should be made visible, a tangible thing that you can latch your hands onto. Though, after the Industrial Revolution, something interesting happened. Perhaps in the 1890s, maybe earlier, maybe later, the dawn of the non-human operated machine caused a different effect. Physical labor became more and more, increasingly more intensive. It was required that more work hours were to be established, especially during the Great Depression of the 1920s in America. Education was seen as something, or perhaps school was seen as something, to keep the society's reprobates in. It was something like a place, perhaps a prison, perhaps a penitentiary, to keep the reprobates, the delinquents, and those who were not fit for blue-collar work in. Education was not lofty as it were once. It was reserved for the great scholars and the thinkers of their time. People who could tangibly invent something. People who could contribute to society with a snap out of thin air. This view had to be changed. If education was to receive its rightful place at the top of society as a right and as an obligation for all children and for all people who wanted to learn something and do something with their lives, there had to be a revolution brought about. The 8-hour work week, perhaps, was the first step towards this. Let's talk about more of that. The 8-hour work week was not first invented by Henry Ford. It was a concept that was brought about into a thesis by the second Philip, the king of Spain, Sicily, and many different countries. It was first theorized for factory workers, not education. But then, education became something like a human right, a fundamental piece of society that children were meant to receive. Even in countries like Turkey, who were formed later and were in an admittedly bad situation, this form of education was held in a high pedestal, and thus it was seen as not an excuse to stop kids from working, but rather as a place to send kids so that they may decide how they were going to be working. In fact, you could say that education was probably valid with its ups and downs, and it has a very turbulent existence. And it does, you'd be correct. You know, it still keeps changing, and it will keep changing, as nothing is a constant and nothing is forever. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy, pulls us apart and pulls us together. Though this doesn't mean that we are imperfect, but it doesn't mean that we are perfect either. You have to decide that for yourself and see what fits you best. People criticize education as a means of keeping people as flocks of sheep. Other people say that education is the best thing to have happened to humanity since sliced bread. Some people view it apathetically, don't care about it, or don't let it affect their lives, and some people go through the motions forever, not minding any of it, but minding their business, rather. It's a very turbulent existence, as I said. You have to consider that. You have to decide for yourself. But one thing that I can assure you is for sure, is that it should be a fundamental right for all people, and something that we view on a high pedestal, and something that we should care about. For people in the future, they must receive education. No person should fall to the death trap that is ignorance, and no child should be led into their own devices without being taught. Thank you so much.